Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor and privilege to invite you all to the launch of the Bank's 2025 African Economic Outlook Report on making Africa's capital work better for Africa's development, which is also the theme of the Bank's 2025 annual meetings here in Abidjan. The launch event is scheduled on the 27th of May 2025 from 12:45 to 13:45 hours Abidjan time. The significant global trade policy shifts in recent months, the changing policies on official development assistance, and the heightened global uncertainties with declining concessional financing have created significant headwinds to Africa's growth momentum. As a result, Africa's growth outlook for 2025 and 2026 have been moderately revised downwards to 3.9% and 4% respectively. These projections reflect 0.2 and 0.4 percentage point downgrades from our February 2025 estimates due to the expected impacts of increased trade tariffs announced by the United States in April 2025. But even after accounting for the above, 21 African countries will see an expansion in output exceeding 5% in 2025, and 4 of them, namely Ethiopia, Niger, Rwanda, and Senegal, could attain the minimum 7% threshold required to address poverty and achieve inclusive growth and sustainable development in Africa. This demonstrates the continued resilience of Africa's economies. However, Africa's real GDP per capita growth is estimated at 0.9% in 2024 and projected to reach 1.5 and 1.7% in 2025 and 2026 respectively. And the growth performance and outlook varied across Africa's regions, reflecting differences in the quality of macroeconomic fundamentals, existing macroeconomic buffers, and degrees of integration into global trade. Once more, real GDP growth in East Africa is expected to accelerate from 4.3% in 2024 to 5.9% in 2025 and 2026, accounting for potential impacts of trade shocks. This performance is encouraging, but Africa still lags other regions in GDP per capita growth rates, and hence youth unemployment and poverty persist. There are many key challenges in Africa's macroeconomic fundamentals. 1. Deepening geopolitical fragmentation, regional conflicts, rising global uncertainty have spurred by emerging trade policies in several countries clouds the outlook in the short and medium terms. First, inflationary and foreign exchange rate pressures are easing, but the dynamics remain mixed. Inflation averaged 18.7% in 2024 and is projected to decline to 13.8% in 2025 and 9.9% in 2026, the first time it is expected to hit single digits in the post-pandemic period. Of the 28 countries that recorded currency depreciation rates in 2023, 17 of them either appreciated or reduced their foreign exchange losses in 2024. And 21 countries are expected to experience a currency depreciation in 2025, while 25 of them could appreciate against the United States dollars. Second, while public debt ratios are projected to stabilize at below 65% in 2025 and 2026, they remain above pre-pandemic levels of around 50%. However, the true challenge in Africa's debt lies not in the volume of Africa's debt, but in its quality and structure, and the transparency of obligations and the capacity of African countries to manage debt effectively and strategically. In addition, dwindling external financial flows continues to strain fiscal capacity in Africa. following the rebound in external financial flows to Africa in 2023 due to improvements in portfolio flows. The growing tide of aid cuts by major donors, combined with the effect of the increase in global uncertainty, is likely to depress external inflows in the short to the medium terms. On the other hand, external capital outflows from Africa through illicit financial flows, corruption, risk mispricing, and international profit shifting by international corporations was estimated at about $587 billion in 2022. When we include the huge losses of resources through public infrastructure financing inefficiencies estimated at 39%, Africa is losing far much more than 3 times the total external financial inflows it receives each year, including diaspora remittances, which was the largest source of inflows in recent years. To build more resilient economies, therefore, African countries should focus more on improving efficiencies in domestic revenue mobilization, retention, and use through enhanced economic governance and rule of law. When Africa improves the allocative efficiency of its own resources, global capital will follow Africa's capital to accelerate investments in productive sectors across Africa. While the recent escalation in trade tariffs illustrates the vulnerabilities inherent in over-reliance on foreign trade and global value chains, they also represent an opportunity for African countries to deepen intra-regional trade, strengthen economic diversification, and regional integration. The second chapter of the report emphasizes the need for improving effective domestic capital mobilization and efficient use. In this regard, we find that Africa's slow pace of socio-economic transformation remains a paradox. Despite its rich endowments in most forms of capital, especially in natural and human capital, with nearly 80% of public expenditures financed from domestic resources, Africa's government revenue to GDP ratios lags that of other world regions, even as development financing gaps widen. Africa's weak tax effort largely explains the underperformance in government revenue collection from both tax and non-tax sources. The report finds that with right policies, Africa could mobilize and retain about $1.43 trillion in domestic resources from boosting tax and non-tax revenues and curbing resource leakages and implementing measures to reduce Africa's risk premium. By curbing illicit financial flows and corruption, tackling profit shifting, and enhancing macroeconomic policy management to improve the pricing of risks and risk perception in Africa, African countries can retain more than $587 billion annually, enough capital to close the financing gaps for accelerating structural transformation, and 3 times more than the total external financing received by Africa in 2022. In addition, inefficiencies in public infrastructure, investment costs Africa 39% of total infrastructure financing annually. The third chapter therefore examined the role of institutions, economic governance, and the rule of law in making Africa's capital work better for Africa's development. We find that despite significant commitments to institutional and governance reforms, implementation has been slow and selective, with significant variations across countries due to both domestic and external factors, all of which are carefully analyzed in this report. This directly hinders the mobilization and efficient use of capital, both domestic and external. For example, Africa's governance and institutional challenges could amplify the impact of declining external development financing in Africa. The evidence shows that political stability, government effectiveness, and absence of violence respect for the rule of law are all closely linked with higher FDI inflows, portfolio equity inflows, and debt financing, largely because countries with these attributes provide a stable and predictable environment which attracts foreign investors. State capture also aggravates Africa's institutional challenges and weak governance capacity, as captured elites shape laws and regulations to secure tax exemptions, monopolies, and preferred access to public contracts and other privileges. Among the key recommendations of the report, therefore, includes the continued need for 1. Sound macroeconomic policy management. To address the lingering macroeconomic policy challenges, coordinated monetary and fiscal policy management, fiscal prudence, sustainable borrowing to enhance debt productivity, preemptive debt restructuring and reforms, and addressing insecurity and conflicts remain urgent priorities. 2. Domestic resource mobilization, retention, and efficient use remain critical. Enhancing state capacity and institutions to mobilize domestic revenues, both tax and non-tax revenues, natural resource royalties, manage public finances, curb illicit financial flows, resource theft and corruption, and push for repatriation of stolen wealth in foreign banks will go a long way to make Africa's fiscal capital work better for Africa's development. The report identifies specific measures to boost domestic resource mobilization in Africa, which I will leave you to read when you get the report. 2. Natural resources beneficiation, natural capital accounting, upgrading systems of national accounts is critical. For example, implementing natural capital accounting and upgrading systems of national accounts will enhance GDP estimates and increase fiscal headrooms in African countries. Upgrading systems of national accounts and institutionalizing natural capital accounting and the systems of environmental economic accounting could significantly increase GDP measurements in natural resource-rich countries in Africa. Our recent study on measuring the green wealth of countries show that by integrating the carbon sequestration value of Africa's forests alone, the continent's estimated GDP could have increased by $66.1 billion in 2022. Other policy recommendations to make Africa's natural capital work better for Africa's development includes natural resource beneficiation and value chain development, building regional resource corridors, democratizing natural resource management, progressively replacing mining concession agreements, MCAs, with minerals development agreements, MDAs, and regular reporting on mining contracts to foster transparency and accountability to citizens. Another key recommendation of the report is deepening regional economic integration, trade, and regional capital markets. African countries should fast-track economic integration and trade through the full implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Implement the customs union, eliminate persistent trade and non-trade barriers to regional economic integration and trade, diversify their export markets, accelerate investments in regional transport and logistics infrastructure, and the development of regional capital markets to achieve economies of scale and the agency needed to engage productively in the increasingly multipolar world. To succeed, free movement of the factors of production, especially labor and capital, scaling up trade in Africa's local currencies, the implementation of the Pan-African Payment Systems, PAPS, are all prerequisites. Finally, the implementation of preferred procurement policies to increase effective demand for African products by Africans in Africa is important. By creating effective and targeted demand for African products, the continent can boost the emerging private enterprise in key sectors such as car manufacturing, ICT, agriculture, green minerals value chains, and more, depending on the regional and national competitive and comparative advantages of countries. To make Africa's financial institutions work better for Africa's development, there is need for integration and consolidation of Africa's capital markets to broaden and deepen their capacity to achieve economies of scale and become globally competitive. Considering the significant lower costs of MDB financing, it will be a wise investment for African countries to fully capitalize African multilateral development banks and national DFIs to benefit from their franchise value, experiences in Africa's development financing, and their capacity to leverage resources by more than 4 times to accelerate development financing in Africa. Such MDBs include the African Development Bank Group, the African Development Fund, and National Development Financing Institution. Innovative financing instruments such as social bonds, synthetic securitization, balance sheet optimization, risk transfer transactions, and diversifying funding sources from financial markets can increase their ability to mobilize long-term and stable funding and crowd in private sector financing, and these will be of critical importance. There is urgent need to accelerate the establishment of missing domestic financing institutions such as the African Financing Stability Mechanism, AFSM, and the African Monetary Institute, AMI, to address the growing debt refinancing risks for the continent and drive price stability, respectively. Fast-tracking the establishment of the African Credit Rating Agency, AFCRA, to complement the work of the global rating agencies in working with African countries to improve the objectivity and reliability of risk pricing of African sovereigns could help reduce the risk premium paid by African countries and the growing disquiet around the global risk rating methodologies, now broadly seen as biased against the poor. On leveraging human capital development, retention, and deployment, the report makes 2 key recommendations. 1, the need to scale up investments in appropriate education and health services and bridge the gender gap. To make Africa's capital work better for Africa's development, countries must accelerate investments in appropriate education and health services for citizens. Leveraging the diaspora is the second recommendation. Immigration of highly educated individuals and skilled workers presents a considerable loss to Africa. The growing African diaspora rose from 19.7 million in 1990 to 45.8 million in 2024. These can be important sources of innovative and stable financing for Africa's development. For example, the volume of Africa's remittance inflows surpasses the key external financial inflows such as FDI and ODA combined. In 2023, the total remittances to Africa stood at $91.1 billion US, or 3.1% of GDP. And this is projected to reach $283 billion by 2025. It is also estimated that deliberate policies to reduce the cost of remittances and formalize informal transfers could raise the upper bound of Africa's remittance market to as much as $500 billion US. Compared to ODA and FDI, therefore, diaspora remittances play a critical role for Africa's development financing. They also tend to be countercyclical during economic downturns, pandemics, and natural disasters, and can act as a stabilizing factor that ensures the continuous flow of financing, even in difficult times. Beyond remittances, the African diaspora represents a critical mass of African expertise with rich networks in their countries of residence. Policies that harness them through diaspora bonds, securitization of remittances, trade promotion, knowledge and technology transfer programs, and brain circulation could significantly make this class of Africa's capital work better for Africa's development. Current policies in some countries that exclude the diaspora from participating in democratic governance of their home countries is therefore considered counterproductive. While experimentation on imposing levies on diaspora incomes can improve nationalism among diasporans and hence foster greater interest in ensuring good governance, additional work is required to mitigate the risks of double taxation. Finally, there is need for strategic partnerships on both sides. African countries should focus on forging strategic and equitable partnerships to enhance Africa's resource mobilization and economic sovereignty. In an increasingly multipolar world, growing uncertainties in global trade regimes and recurrent disruptions of global value chains, countries need to refocus on strategic partnerships informed by mutual interests. To achieve this, there is urgent need for a true African unity, a strengthened and well-capitalized African Union, African Development Bank Group, and other Pan-African and national development finance institutions to support that strategy. Next, change of mindset is critical. African leaders and citizens need to prioritize fiscal sovereignty over fiscal dependence. True African unity and one voice, with Africans standing together as a united Africa in a free trade zone where there is free movement of factors of production and maintains sovereignty over its natural and human capital and supports each other to harness, retain, and effectively use its capital to work for Africa is critical. The current model of reliance and expectation of help from elsewhere has not worked and will not work. It was never designed to work for Africa or for any developing country. To make Africa's capital work better for Africa's development, Africa must break from historical past dependencies and strategically reassess and establish productive partnerships that beneficiates, retains, and effectively uses Africa's capital in Africa for African development. And Africans must break the current tastes and preferences for foreign products. Cars, equipments, clothing, electronics, and even food. Smart industrial and import substitution policies recommended in this report, such as local content policies, franchising, and preferred procurement policies, could offer low-hanging fruits. Without strategic policies to boost demand for made-in-Africa products, industrialization in Africa would be a mirage. Then, what could the global community do to help? First, the continued reform of the global financial architecture remain critical. There is need to reform the debt architecture, especially with regard to the risk rating methodologies, DSA methodologies, and also reform the global tax architecture to curb international profit shifting, and continued reforms in the MDB system to make them smarter in using risk capital to mobilize private sector capital for development in developing countries. Development partners should also change their mindsets from an extractives for export agenda to a win-win model of equal partnerships that benefits all parties.